Yeah, so just hello to all of you again, and thank you for those of you that came to the puja last night. It was great to have you, all your faces on the screen in that shrine room. It was really lovely, really, really lovely. So this morning we're going to hear a presentation from Dhammarati on conceit, and we're going to go into that in a bit more depth personally after a kind of general discussion. So the timing is presentation from Dhammarati. Then after that, we'll get into our usual study groups, our usual discussion groups. And after about 45 minutes, we'll have a tea break, or we'll have a break. And then at 11:30 UK time, which will be in about 1.5 hours, we'll all come back together again, and then we'll be subdivided into much smaller personal home groups, where we can talk personally about our experience of conceit. That's where we're headed. Yep. So I think probably we've got everybody in. So Dhammarati, if you'd like to just start us. Thank you.
Sure. So we divvied up the topics between the different presenters so we could sort of speak from experience as far as possible. So I'm talking this morning on conceit and distraction. So Saddhaloka was saying yesterday, told a little bit of the story, that the setup for this is Richimpa returning from India and Milarepa traveling to meet him. And as they're coming towards the meeting, the way the story gets set up, they're both having a train of thought. So Rechungpa, before they meet, according to the story, is thinking to himself, heretofore I have been following my guru's instructions to serve the Dharma and sentient beings. My guru's compassion and grace are indeed great, Richimpa says. But then he goes on to say, that I am much more learned in Buddhist philosophy and logic than Milarepa is. And he wonders to himself, I wonder if Milarepa will return the obeisance to me when I bow down to him. So Rechungpa is wondering if Milarepa will bow to him because he is now so learned. And Bhante is quite droll on this when he in the commentary. He says it's probably true that Richimpa is now much more learned in Buddhist philosophy and logic than Milarepa is. And Bhante goes on to say Milarepa has only gained enlightenment. So Milarepa gained enlightenment. And Rechungpa is wondering if Milarepa will return his bow. And they meet, and Milarepa is bowed to by Rechungpa and shows no sign whatsoever of bowing to Rechungpa back. So the Bhante sort of, or the story talks about Milarepa's thought process. And Milarepa is thinking to himself that Rechungpa, no matter what the cause, he says, I must rescue Rechungpa from this hindrance of pride. I'll come back to this idea of no matter what the cause, but Milarepa is speculating about what it is that's caused this pride in Rechungpa. So first of all, he's been hanging out in all these Indian monasteries, and Milarepa thinks maybe he's got into bad company in the monasteries. Then the second thing that goes through his mind is maybe Rechungpa has been possessed by demons. And Bhante in the commentary says about this that, you know, your practice can be going on quite nicely. You know, you've got a bit of mindfulness, you've got a bit of positive emotion, and then something happens, and it's like you've got a totally independent state of mind just takes over. Again, this is me speaking from direct personal experience, suddenly something that you didn't see coming is there as a sort of strong experience. So Milarepa is speculating that maybe Rechungpa has been possessed by the demon of pride. So Milarepa decides to, no matter what the cost, he wants to rescue Rechungpa from this hindrance of pride. So they meet, and Richimpa is totally stiff. So he's meeting his teacher for the first time for, I guess, well, certainly months, maybe years. And rather than any sense of spontaneously being pleased to see Milarepa, he's very stiff and very formal. And he asks after Milarepa's health, and he asks after the health of his Milarepa's other students, his Repa brothers. And that this stiffness, Bhante says, often happens when two people encounter each other and when status is at stake, when you're worried about your status at whatever way, whatever level in relationship to somebody else. Bhante says he doesn't even experience happiness at seeing his guru. There's no mention that Rechungpa was overjoyed to see Milarepa after such a long time. All he was concerned about was whether Milarepa was going to return his obeisance and recognize him as an equal. So like status is maybe a particular way of seeing this, but I wonder if we recognize when an anxiety or an idea about ourselves, an idea about the other person gets in the way of a sort of simple, spontaneous responsiveness. Anyway, after all these months, after all these years even, Richimpa has this sort of stiffness in response to Milarepa coming out of this concern about status. So Milarepa sings a little song in response, and he says, Richimpa, have you returned from India? Did you feel tired and weary on the journey? Has your mind been sharpened and refreshed? Has your voice been good for singing? Did you practice your guru's instructions? Did you secure the teachings that you wanted? Did you obtain all the various instructions? Have you gained much knowledge and much learning? Have you noticed your pride and egotism? So a nice little sting in the tail. And Milarepa brings attention directly to Richimpa's pride and egotism. One of the things I was thinking about this, I remember Bhante saying this about the Buddha's teaching, and saying that a lot of the Buddha's teaching isn't teaching of the Dharma in abstract. It's us overhearing a conversation that the Buddha had. And very often Dharma teaching is, in the Pali Canon and in Milarepa's songs, is a response from the Buddha, response from Milarepa to the direct spiritual needs of the person that they're speaking to. And that's the case here. It's not that Milarepa suddenly decides to sing a song about the 5 kleshas. Actually, he's meeting Richimpa, he's encountering this experience of pride, and he's responding to what it is that he's encountering. So Richimpa might be bringing a preconception to this, but actually with Milarepa, you've got this responsiveness. And what we're listening to, what we're reading in reading this song, is just overhearing the conversation between Milarepa and Richimpa. So that brings us on to this whole klesha of pride. Or if you remember yesterday, we were looking at the 5 kleshas, and you've got these 3 root kleshas of ignorance, craving, and aversion. And there are 2 left. There's pride and envy under one list, or pride and distraction under the other list. And Milarepa in this song is talking about those two kleshas, the pride and the distraction. I was thinking pride and envy are really just two sides of the same klesha, that the sort of pride is our own fixed idea of ourselves, and the envy is just the kind of fixed idea, the aversive response to another person. And it's almost like what you've got with pride and envy is the kleshas of aversion and craving and ignorance expressing themselves as this sort of polarized relationship of subject and object. So that basic sort of polarized split gets expressed in pride and envy. And distraction I'll say a little bit about later. So there's a contrast that Bhante makes when he's talking about this that I found a helpful way into this idea of pride. One of the things that Bhante says is that you're listening to Rechungpa concerned about status. You're listening to this quite stiff, preconceived idea of how the communication is going to go. And Bhante in the commentary says you can't have a preconception about how a communication is going to go. He said you don't know what another person's experience is like in any real sense until you're in communication. And I just found that contrast an interesting one, that one of the things about pride is this sort of self-view, view of ourselves, a view of the other on the one hand, and this idea of communication. And I suppose what communication sort of suggests to me is this spontaneous, responsive awareness, a kind of meeting of two streams of experience, and out of that encounter, whatever arises between them, you get that process of communication. I was remembering Bhante's description of vital mutual responsiveness. So this contrast of Rechumpa's pride on the one hand being contrasted with a simple, spontaneous meeting on the other. So there's sort of something maybe in there that gives us a bit of a clue, both about the nature of pride and about the antidote to it, what it is that we can do in practice to work against pride. There's a second hindrance, that a second klesha that Milarepa then goes on to talk about. He's asking after Rechumpa's turmoil and fondness for diversion. And this brings us on to the second poison, or the fifth poison, if you like, of distraction. And one of the things that Bhante says about this, he's talking about distraction as a klesha. And I have to say, I found this a little bit puzzling to begin with. You know, like I can understand ignorance, aversion, and craving as kleshas. They seem really pretty fundamental. And even I can understand conceit and envy as kleshas. That sort of polarization into self and other seem pretty fundamental. So they all, it's sort of fairly straightforward to understand how they're kleshas. But distraction seemed a bit more superficial than that. And I was puzzled to think of why distraction should be counted as a klesha. But Bhante in the commentary goes on to say that turmoil and fondness for diversion go much deeper than we usually think. And Milarepa is singing that he resides alone in perfect ease. And Bhante says that the perfect ease that Milarepa is residing in goes much deeper than ease in the usual sense. it goes on to say that Milarepa is talking about a complete relaxation, which is not just physical or psychological, but it's existential. Milarepa's ease is the cessation of all striving, because there's nothing to strive for. So if you think of distraction in that sense, it's being the absence of that existential relaxation, that's the cessation of all striving, because there's nothing to strive for. I think we might spend our time in the groups quite well if we try and get a little bit of what is that getting at? What does that mean in our own practice? But I wanted to say something about it again, just like thinking about my own practice and thinking about any kind of parallel I could find for this. You know, this language of ease and this language of relaxation is a very explicit emphasis on, according to Bhante in the Mahamudra tradition, this way of thinking about practice as relaxation and practice as ease. But I think there are parallels to it in any Buddhist practice. I think this whole thing about taste of freedom has something about this. But I was thinking, for example, in the 6 element practice, you get a bit of a hint of what this existential ease is like. The 6 element practice, the way it seems to me is you start off with comparatively simple experience, and then it gets subtler and subtler. So you're starting off looking at self-clinging in relationship to the earth element, for example. And then you're just noticing that what we assume is a fixed and separate element of our own experience actually comes from the universal element, returns to the universal element. It's just part of, if I can use the language, part of a flow. And the way we do the 6 element practice, it talks about letting go or giving back. But I think in that language of letting go, like I think I've always thought of it as a little bit existential, even a little bit conceptual. But I think that letting go actually, in a sense, is a relaxation. It's catching the tightness of identification, it's catching the tightness of clinging, and it's releasing the clinging. And in that release of clinging, there's an experience of freedom, an experience, well, I'd like to suggest that the language of ease and existential relaxation would be another way of talking about what we're doing in the 6 element practice. And then that process just gradually goes deeper into subtler and subtler elements. And you come to consciousness, and you've got the tightness of grasping. And what you're recognizing in consciousness is that just in the same way as the earth element, we mistake it as something fixed and something separate. You realize how fluid, you realize how much it's a co-arising, and there's a letting go, there's a relaxation of that self-identification. And Milarepa in the text yesterday was talking about letting go of clinging to the myriad forms. And I think in the 6 element practice, when you're bringing attention to consciousness, it's not that the myriad forms stop arising, but that habit of clinging to the myriad forms starts to get relaxed. And you relax into this experience of an open, spacious consciousness that, as Bhante says, there's nothing to strive for. And without being too fancy pants about it, even the idea of somebody doing the striving becomes a little more fluid and a little more provisional than it is. But I was thinking, even in very simple practice, like the mindfulness of breathing, you get this deepening process of relaxation. Analio, in one of his recent books about mindfulness of breathing is quite interesting on this. But Bhante says that in Satipatthana practice, what you're doing is that you're bringing awareness to the whole spectrum of experience. And the whole spectrum of experience in the Satipatthana framework is your body, your feelings, your mind, and the objects of mind. And again, you've got this same process of starting off with simple experience, very easily accessible experience, and then that awareness becoming subtler and subtler, and looking at a deeper and deeper, subtler and subtler experience. But one of the points that Analayo makes is that the same process of bringing awareness in and relaxing happens on every level of experience. And to me, this just throws such a kind of helpful light on this process of relaxation. So if you don't mind, let me just say something about it. But you take your breath into the body. So first of all, you're aware of the breath, and the breath just gets a little bit subtler, a little bit freer. You become aware of the body, and what you become aware of is where the body's tight, where it's held, where it's tense. And the classic texts on mindfulness of breathing just says that when you do that, the body calms down. So you've got this process of you become aware of the body, and there's a natural releasing. If I can use this language, a natural relaxing. In the same sort of way, you bring awareness to the feelings, you're aware of all the turmoil that goes on, but the way the text, the Satipatthana texts describe it, is that the feelings release, that there's this sort of calming down of the feelings, there's a sort of releasing and relaxing around the feelings, and a kind of spontaneous move towards Priti and Sukha, basically. When the clinging stops, Piti and Sukha is the natural upflowing of experience. Same with mental events. You take awareness into what the mind's doing. And basically, you're moving from being caught in your experience to just relaxing back into the awareness. There's this open, present, non-clinging, non-caught awareness in relationship to all of our experience. And in that very simple, if you've done mindfulness of breathing for any amount of time, you've got this sense of being available to your experience without getting tight around it, without getting caught in it. And that relaxing back into awareness, where you're present to the myriad forms, but you're not clinging to the myriad forms, I think gives us a little hint of what that existential relaxation is like. That to use the language, there's a sort of natural awareness that when we don't grasp, when we don't cling, there's just a very deep relaxation of non-willed availability to experience. And I think going back to six element practice, I love the six element practice. I love that language of letting go. But even the language of letting go, the language of giving back, can sound a little bit conceptual. And actually, you can talk about exactly the same process, I think, as a process, as Milarepa talks about it, as an existential relaxation and an existential ease in relationship to our experience. So you've got that sense, I think, of as we take awareness into experience, as you see where it's caught, whether it's your body, whether it's your feelings, whether it's the mental events, you see how you habitually cling. And there's this capacity to just open the clinging, just to let it go, to relax back into the openness, to relax back into the ease that maybe gives you something of what this klesha of distraction is getting at. and what the state of mind is when we're not caught in that sense that we're not whole, there's some object out there that's going to make us whole. When you realize that that just is not the nature of experience, there's a letting go and a relaxing back into that spaciousness. So in my own practice, trying to map what Milarepa is saying back onto my own experience of meditation, that's the sort of sense that I could make of it, but maybe it would be, again, sort of useful in the groups, just to look at what would we understand this sort of moving away from distraction as a klesha into this sense of ease and relaxation to be. One last point, just coming back to this point of no matter what the cause, Milarepa says, I must rescue Rechungpa from the hindrance of pride. One of the things that Bhante says about this is you don't always know where unskillful mental states arise from. You know, like you've got a strong experience of craving, you've got a strong experience of aversion, you've got a strong experience of confusion. It's just a fact. It's just there in experience. So this idea of no matter what the cause, Bhante says it's difficult sometimes to know what the cause of an unskillful mental state is, but it doesn't really matter, he says. What's important is that you've got an idea of what that skillful mental state feels like, or what that skillful mental state is like. And you've got enough energy available to start to move in the direction of the skillful. So to try and ground this, if you're working with the habit of pride, one of the ways that we can work against it is just a more careful, receptive awareness to our own emerging experience rather than the fixed view that we have, and a careful, responsive awareness to the other person that we're coming into relationship with. So we might not totally break the klesha of pride, but you're moving in a direction of awareness, openness, spontaneous, well, so Bhante talks about a vital mutual responsiveness. That vital mutual responsiveness seems to me to be the direction that lets us move away from pride. And in terms of the klesha of distraction, we're just starting to attend more deeply to what our experience is. So rather than the kind of alienation, rather than the compulsion to find the object that's going to make us feel whole, it's a connection with our body, it's a connection with our feelings, it's an open awareness of our emerging mental states, and it's the kind of depth of connection that piti and sukha, this idea of joy and happiness, just that happiness comes from a deepening process of connection to our own emerging experience and dropping the view that we have of ourselves that separates ourselves from that open, impermanent, insubstantial flow of experience. And again, it can sound quite highfalutin, but it starts with just that act of attention, that act of awareness, or from a more emotional point of view, that act of metta that becomes alive to experience as it emerges. So you don't need to be too anxious about what created the unskillful mental state. You don't even need to be too anxious about what caused it. You've been possessed by demons briefly. You know what the skillful mental state feels like, and you want enough energy available to get behind that momentum of moving away from the unskillful, moving towards the skillful. It can start off with awareness of the body, and it gradually deepens into an experience of liberation in relationship to all phenomena. And the important thing is get the direction going. So maybe in the groups, just a little bit about getting clear about what the nature of the klesha is, and what in our practice moves us in the direction of liberation from the pride, liberation from the distraction. We're going to go into pride in quite a bit more depth in the second half of the morning, but maybe in this next session, just being a bit clear about what it is that it's trying to point us towards, just getting the idea clear about the alternatives that we've got in our experience to pride and to distraction. So thank you very much.
So conceit, it's traditionally spoken of, thought of in terms of seeing oneself as better, worse than others, or equal to others. So, but all of it to do with a sort of consolidation of a sense of self around those sort of ideas. They're all ways of reinforcing self-clinging through comparing ourselves with others. And yeah, the way we consolidate, yeah, it's a way that we consolidate this sense of who we are in the world. It might be painful, but it gives us a sense of stability. We know where we stand. And this idea of ourselves and in relation to others, it becomes the basis of the strategies that we then adopt and navigate through life. So for example, if we tell ourselves that we're not lovable, not worthy of love, we'll tend to avoid people and situations that might invite love and rejection that we've told ourselves that's inevitable. And if, on the other hand, our story is that we're super intelligent, smart, we're not going to waste our time with people we think are stupid, unless, of course, it gives us a chance to show off how smart we are. So, you know, our story of better, worse, equal, then manifests in these strategies that we adopt in terms of life. And, you know, one of those striking little points that came out of the text, Bhante spoke of conceit as an intellectual klesha, because it's built on and reinforced by the stories that we tell ourselves again and again. And yeah, just really recognizing these stories. They may be outdated, they may even never have been true, but we can hold on to them even when we realize how stupid it is. You know, people will maybe laugh at us if we tell them the story that we tell ourselves. Or even worse, they might hug us and tell us how wonderful we really are and not to be so silly. So, you know, there's all sorts of reasons why we don't want to share these stories that we tell ourselves. So, yeah, the question I'd like to encourage us to be looking at in these smaller groups is, what are the stories we tell ourselves? Even if we never really tell them to anyone else. You know, can we admit to ourselves what those stories are? And do we really believe them? Is it just a habitual tendency? The sort of momentum? Is it just old karma, sort of worn out, but still, you know, we keep still giving it an extra shove along? And can we let go? Can we let go of those stories? Can we begin to look objectively at them? And again, it can be really telling just to notice the resistance. You know, we've got a lot of our sense of self can be invested in these stories, even these hidden stories. Yeah, and if we never told others these stories, it might be interesting to see what happens when we try to articulate them. They're probably full of contradictions and twists and turns, but just trying to put those stories, these old stories that we keep repeating to ourselves, out in the light of day can be very interesting. And if in telling them, do we catch a flavour of self-pity or of pride, of hurt or anger? What's there in those stories that we tell ourselves? And I think as well, looking at these stories that we tell ourselves that reinforce our conceit, it doesn't have to be angst-ridden sort of confessional stuff. It might actually be quite fun. It might be quite amusing, enjoyable, liberating, just to sort of share these stories and laugh at them with others, rather than feeling it's sort of going to have to be this painful confessional business. And again, another striking teaching of Bhante's is metta as objective emotion. Metta as that heart response to others that is actually, and ourselves, that is just honest, objective, really sees ourselves as we truly are, really sees others as they truly are here and now, and also sees the possibility of change in ourselves and others. So metta as objective emotion, can we bring something of that quality of metta to looking at these stories? You've probably come across some of the paintings of Saddhaloka. I've known him quite well over the years, and he used to work with us in the team at Saddhaloka, and he had a phrase of, we're all just a mess in process, aren't we? We're all just a mess in process. But you can see it as a process towards enlightenment. We might be a bit untidy and a bit messy, but we're actually wanting to have that, aspiring to have that process move towards enlightenment. And if we can begin to let go of the old limiting stories that feed into this klesha of conceit, bring real awareness to surround them, see and acknowledge ourselves as we are, then that process that carries us towards enlightenment can really start to unfold in more creative and into greater freedom. So that's what we're going to be trying to do over this next while once we go into our group. So we've got 45 minutes, so not a huge amount of time, but time to maybe begin to look at our own encounter, our own engagement with this klesha of conceit. Okay, so James, press the button.